This next project is a great way to use up some of your scraps. This is a wine cooler, and I've used all kinds of assorted scrap material in the production of this. It's utilizing a stainless steel insert, much like a coffee mug but on a larger scale. You can get these stainless steel inserts from a website called smooth-turnings.com. That's also a site that sells the inserts for travel mugs. And as I say, this is to be used to put wine on the table to keep white wine cool. But it can also be used for a variety of other things. You could put it on a kitchen counter next to the stove and store all your wooden kitchen utensils. Or another suggestion would be flower arrangements. You could put water in this, or you could put dry flowers, something like this. Once again, the first step to any project, getting all that material milled. Here you can see my Zeracody board that I'm going to use for the feature ring. You've got to start with a design, a blueprint. I'm going to use some graph paper here and sketch out something. My insert is 7 inches tall and about 3.8 inches in diameter. It's pretty much a straight cylinder. So here's an outline designating the stainless steel insert. Now around that I'll surround it with wood. I'm going to build my rings with this material, which is over 1 inch wide. The segments are actually going to be originally this tall, but I'll split the rings into 1/2 inch tall rings after they're built. So here's my outside dimensions, the outside border of the cylinder I'm going to build. Here's a floating base location in the bottom that I'll insert. I've marked out the different layers here in pencil. Here's my outside diameter that I've determined. Doing the simple math with pi, I can calculate my segment length. In this case, it's going to be, 1.16. Now that's approximate. I'll do a test ring to make sure when I cut my first segments. That Zeracody ring in the middle is going to have to be much larger segments because I'm only going to put 6 of the large Zeracody pieces, so they have to be a lot thicker. I've numbered everything. I put them in pairs because, like I say, I'm going to split rings. 12 segment rings, and here's all the information I need. The base ring will be ebony. I'm going to cut my segments 3 at a time. I'll use this hold down with a piece of foam. That'll give me consistent down pressure. The key is to have an angled stop block parallel to the cut line. By lining up the tips on that angled stop block, I can produce 3 identical segments. Here I'm just getting rid of some dust, and then I'll do some dry fitting, arranging the colors in a random pattern, just checking to make sure these are going to fit nicely. Here's my stack of all the components I need for 2 of these vessels, all ready for glue. To glue these together, I'll once again use the half ring technique, using little half pieces of dowel as spacers. This will ensure perfect fits. Lots of rubber bands, plenty of pressure, putting these half rings together. Here they are, just lined up on a pipe outside my shop drying. About an hour or 2 later, I can take these apart. I'll true them up on the disc sander, get nice fits on the half rings, and put full rings together. Now these will go back on the pipe to dry. Now while those are drying, I can start working on my Zeracody ring. This one's a little different. There's only 6 large segments, and I'm going to align the grain, so I have to trim off after each cut. Just trim off a little bit so I can flip back to the face side and have all the grain line up. Takes a little more time to do it this way, but it's worth the effort to get that kind of effect of having the grain all line up like this. So here are my 2 Zeracody rings. They were glued together the same way as the others. Notice the light colored segments in between the Zeracody segments. By this time these other rings have cured. I can get these bands off And I want to get a nice, smooth, gluable surface on each side of all those rings, so I can then mount them on my chuck and split them into various, smaller rings. Here I'm just taking a small piece of myrtle wood that'll be used. When I split all the rings, I tried to be as accurate as possible, but there are minor differences. Running them through a drum sander solves that problem. If you don't have a drum sander, you'll have to do it one at a time on the lathe. Here I'm marking the center of 4 segments on each ring, and I can line up the seams on the centers and glue pairs together just to speed up the process. After cleaning them with a blast of air and applying a bead of glue, it's a pretty simple matter just to line up seams with pencil marks. These are all the same diameter. 6 spring clamps seems to do a pretty good job, and out on the pipe they go for curing. The next step, I can start building my cylinder. I've got a piece of MDF that's been trued up round, screwed onto a faceplate, and just using some spring clamps I'll attach one of my rings of ebony. Now I can true up the roundness and take a piece of that off, about maybe a 1/4 inch thickness. Once I've done that, I'm going to flatten this so it'll accept another ring, true up the inside, and then start turning a little half rabbet, a half groove actually, that will fit a floating base. So I've done some preliminary turning, I've measured it. Now I can go over, attach a piece of wood. This is actually laminated veneers, epoxy laminated veneers, very stable material. And I'm going to turn this round about the right size. And I'm going to put a few decorative grooves in the bottom. Why not? It's easy to do. With my floating disc completed, now I can fit it up to my ebony ring. My rabbet is not quite deep enough, so a little work here. Notice I'm actually turning in reverse here. It's just easier to see what I'm doing on that groove. I want that groove to be just a smidgen deeper than the thickness of my disc. And if I go a little too deep, I can always trim a little more off the ebony. A couple of drops of CA glue will keep the disc centered, and then a minimal amount of Titebond around the perimeter. I'm trying to keep the glue away from that interior seam. Upon inspection, it looked a little dry, so I'm putting a little more glue around that outside edge. Now I can attach this with some spring clamps, lining up the seams so I have a bricklay effect. Now after this is set for a while, back on the lathe it goes. I've got to get this flat, ready for the next ring. You cannot be too careful getting rings flat. They have to be perfect. Here you can see with a bright light, I've detected a little low spot. They have to be perfect. I'm putting a thin ring of myrtle wood on here now. This was parted off from another larger ring. And now I'm back to my main body rings. I want nice flat surfaces so I can put these pairs together in units of 4. So they've been blown off and a bead of glue. I'm just eyeballing the alignment of all these seams. This is pretty easy to do when the diameters all match. And some large spring clamps hold these together. In a project like this, you don't have to wait for glue to dry very often, especially if you're making more than one. Here I am truing up this ring of myrtle so I can glue on the first stage of main body rings. The next parts of the project are just truing up rings and adding components. Here I'm hollowing out the inside so it'll fit the insert. It's a little tight here, a little more removal. I'm using an easy rougher tool here, but I want to get it hollowed out at this stage. It's just easier to do. That blue tape was just to check my depth. I've joined 4 more rings. I've hollowed it out, and now I've joined another ring of myrtle wood. By parting this off here, I can use the other part for the other side of the feature ring. I can now true up that, get it ready for this Zericoti ring. This ring's being held by some larger jaws on my chuck, and I'm just rounding it up inside and outside, getting a flat surface so it can now be glued onto my stack. Now I can go back to the lathe, put the last assembly on, which is another pair of rings with a thin ring of the myrtle wood. I'm now perfecting the inside fit. I do not want a super tight fit. There should be a little room for the wood to move. With that fit done, I can now turn the outside of this, do some finish turning. I'm striving for the smoothest finish I can get with my tools, and it's pretty much a straight line. That's why I was using that ruler. Final inspection with a bright light always seems to help. I'm starting off with sanding sealer, universal sanding sealer, inside and out. And here I'm scraping off a coat of sanding sealer. My goal here is just to get the pores filled. In a project such as this with so many different wood species, I'll probably repeat the sanding sealer scrape process over and over at least 3 times, maybe even 4. Then I'll start to sand. Here I'm using 220 to start with. And I'd go every which way, the sander going forward and reverse and the turning going forward and reverse. A bright light after I've gone to at least 400 grit, probably 600 grit in this case. Here's my first coat of poly finish. I'll put probably 4 or 5 coats of this on, and I followed that with a final coat of wax, which I'm buffing here. To take it off, it's a parting tool cut. You can see it's being held by the tailstock in there. I didn't go all the way through with the parting tool, but enough so that I could just knock this off. A little jam chuck here with this piece of MDF allows me to reverse mount this. It's being held now with the tailstock, and that allows me to clean up this bottom edge. A little bit of scraping, followed by a little bit of sanding, followed by a little finish, and the bottom of this is done. Remember that floating base was already previously finished. I've signed it. The last thing to do is to glue the insert in. For adhesive, I'm using just kitchen bath caulking. I'm more concerned about sealing the unit than gluing it in. It's not going to come out of there very easily. So a little pressure, clean up this stainless steel, get the tape off, and we're done with this project.